Hi, my name is Martin Said. I work across the Trust at XP looking at teacher development, specifically in relation to pedagogy, but also to the curriculum. And you're also going to hear from Robbie Campbell, who's still teaching at XP, but is now also studying for his PhD. He's just begun looking into curriculum design. A little bit of contextual information about our trust and our school. We have 6 schools now, 4 primary schools and 2 secondaries, all located in Doncaster. And we started in 2014 with our first secondary school. Our schools have a 3-dimensional focus. We believe that through asking students to produce beautiful work, better than they ever dreamed they could do, that will in turn develop their character and will lead to academic success. And our model is based upon provenance in the US from particularly project-based learning schools like High Tech High and EL Education, formerly known as Expeditionary Learning. High Tech High is really interesting. They start with the product and then they work out from that. What would the standards be that students would need to learn in order for them to successfully be able to make this product? Whereas expeditionary learning schools, they start with the standards and they've done a lot of work on the Common Core state standards, and then they organize the standards based upon the inferential links between them. So if there is a continuum from High Tech High, products as the organizing principles, to EL Education, the links between standards as the organizing principle, I'd say that we at XP School and within the Trust are much closer to EL Education. One of the key differences, and the only reason I don't put us right across on their side, is that in EL Education, they do a lot more discrete teaching than us. They may well do 8 to 10 weeks of a learning expedition or a project, and then they do some discrete teaching before moving on to another expedition. At XP, we tend to do the vast majority of our teaching through learning expeditions. So, why do we do it this way? I think it's important to make the distinction between the national curriculum, or GCSE standards, and the school curriculum. So teachers, I think, have more agency than they might imagine. Typically, they'd make decisions in terms of how they sequence ideas, when topics interleave or are returned to, which text they choose, or which contexts are used to exemplify concepts, even if they're working within a single discipline and within an exam specification, for example. They still decide the sequencing for that. But as well as discussing agency, we need to also discuss purpose. So I think many disagreements in the educational debate at the moment have at their heart differences in opinion on the purpose of education. And if we're to respect the distinction between pedagogy and curriculum, then in turn we need to also consider the purpose of our curriculum too. At XP, we propose that the purpose of our curriculum is aligned to a future 3. This is in that we recognize the epistemic structures that give rise to the disciplines and in turn progression, but because the signature element of our curriculum with these cross-curricular learning expeditions bring together these disciplines, then teachers are recontextualizing agents so that students develop novel insights into one discipline by viewing it through the lens of another. Students learn the story of those disciplines. Students have experience that are outside of their everyday lived experience, but also these experiences help to contextualize learning and encourage them to become agents for positive change. And finally, students have the powerful knowledge and dispositions to achieve criticality and to become part of the conversation of developing new knowledge. So I've said the signature element of our curriculum is a learning expedition, and this is a kind of schematic for what that looks like in practice. These are typically projects that last 8 to 10 weeks, comprising a guiding question, fieldwork, case studies, key anchor texts, and working with experts external to the school. And then finally, a project which leads to a product or a culminating performance that's then shared with families and a wider audience at a celebration of learning event. To exemplify this, to give you an example, I'm going to talk about an expedition called Should I Stay or Should I Go? The guiding question for this expedition was, why should we care about migrants? And in terms of standards, it was primarily a humanities-based learning expedition. At the same time, there was a STEAM expedition happening. But history standards looked at chronology, in particular events in America leading up to the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. In English, they studied of mice and men and developed novel insights into that historical period as a result of combining the text with their knowledge from geography, of looking at push and pull factors which lead to migration. The product that students created was a documentary film which premiered at CAST, which is the kind of prestigious venue in Doncaster. Crucially though, and one of the major components of this expedition was the fieldwork that was done at the Conversation Club. This is a club that's run by volunteers in Doncaster and brings together migrants who are living in Doncaster in sheltered accommodation, and it's pretty much their only time that they can afford to engage with social and leisure activities within Doncaster. Our students sat with them, listened to their stories, played alongside them, and then made this documentary to honour their stories. And in terms of this aim of criticality, students were making links between concepts such as migration, push and pull factors, how a migrant is different to a refugee, how migrants and refugees are different to invaders, having already studied the Norman conquest, and they then go on to study the Viking conquest. And long-term aim for that is we want students to be able to decipher information that they receive and they hear in the media. We want them to be able to see what's happening when a newspaper headline, for example, describes migrants as invaders, and to approach that with criticality and to make their own decisions about the information that they're being provided. This comes from word knowledge. It also comes from world knowledge, but we also believe it comes from lived experience. And those social aspects are crucial. So when our students heard these stories of migrants from the migrants themselves, not from newspapers or from other members of the family, when they honoured those stories, when they made a film, well, we believe that that can change a child forever. And that social aspect of learning is crucially important and mustn't be ignored. Robbie's going to talk to you now a little bit about some of the theory underpinning our curriculum model.
Thank you. So yes, I'm going to talk about some of the theory looking at curriculum making at XP. And you'll have already noticed that XP use a lot of terms normally associated with a Future 2 school, like personalised learning, interdisciplinary curriculum, and real-world learning. So it's easy to assume that XP would be placed at the progressive end of the progressive traditional debate. However, I want to unpack this and analyse the work done at XP to highlight the fact that the XP curriculum might be closer to what Young and Muller would describe as a Future 3. So Young and Muller's work in Knowledge in the Future School describes different curriculum models in terms of curriculum and pedagogy, and it suggests a new model for a school of the future, combining the best of Future 1 and Future 2. So Future 1 schools focus on disciplinary knowledge acquisition without the adaptation to the learner's needs and interests, whereas a Future 2 school will focus heavily on pedagogy, child-centeredness, but might be considered knowledge light. So in contrast, a Future 3 school is both knowledge-led and learner-engaged in order to try and achieve epistemic justice and allowing the learner to think beyond their current context. So Bernstein's work's useful in considering what a Future 3 scenario may look like, particularly his work on classification and framing. So classification refers to the boundary strength between subjects, and therefore an interdisciplinary curriculum like the one at XP can be considered to have weak boundaries between subjects, normally a characteristic of a Future 2 school. So one aim of XP teachers when designing expeditions is to weaken subject boundaries to allow boundary crossing, whilst maintaining the integrity of the individual subject. And I'll come back to this later as one of the main challenges teachers face. There's three other concepts underpinning the Future 3 model that Martin referred to. That's powerful knowledge, curriculum pedagogy distinction, and teachers as curriculum makers. So in summary, an XP curriculum of engagement and for engagement can be thought of as both knowledge-based and teacher-led. So looking at the diagram on the slide, the XP curriculum can be thought of as in the bottom right quadrant, where boundaries between subjects are weak, but it's teacher-led with a strong visible pedagogy. Looking deeper into some of Bernstein's other work, knowledge structures is a really useful piece of work for us as XP teachers because it helps us understand the differences between subjects. And therefore, if we understand the differences between subjects, we can bring them together more effectively. So Bernstein described a subject's conceptual structure on a continuum, from horizontal to hierarchical, where in subjects like history, which have a more horizontal conceptual structure, new knowledge is assimilated. However, in more hierarchical subjects like science and maths, new knowledge is integrated. So new knowledge builds on other prior knowledge. And this highlights the need for correct sequencing and coherence, in particular for hierarchical subjects. And Martin's going to look at this using the progress maps.
One of the things that we noticed when we were mapping the curriculum initially, and we started grouping standards together, was that without a clear through line from year 7 to year 11, gaps would appear and they would need to be plugged. And we often fell into discrete teaching to plug those gaps. So here we see a progress map for chemistry. What we've arrived at is a structure which is very similar to what happens in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. We describe them as bills of rights, but they're a statement of the things that students must know and be able to do by the end of each year. And we have these for year 7, year 8, and so on. And I've used this one just to exemplify a couple of things. First of all, that knowledge is attended to, and that it's studied in increasing depth and complexity as you move through from year to year. And also, pedagogical content knowledge is attended to as well, in terms of the misconceptions that students might have while studying these subjects. To illustrate this difference in the structure of subjects, history, which is more horizontal in structure, we now have a progress map which looks a little different. Knowledge is still attended to. Year 7 students will study challenges to Britain, especially in the 20th century, World War I, World War II. But they'll also study second order concepts such as continuity and change. And you can see as we move into year 8, there's an increasing depth and complexity in those second order concepts also. We then map those standards and track them for each cohort. So here we can see in English language, this is a standard essentially looking at writer's craft. In year 7, students in this cohort studied Beowulf, articles on homelessness, Oliver Twist, so a range of contexts, a range of styles and traditions of writing. And you can see there in that RAG rating, it's amber because we thought at the end of that year group, students haven't quite got generally on maths where we wanted them to get to. In year 8, that was returned to right at the start of the year in Should I Stay or Should I Go? And the assessments and written responses then clearly demonstrated that students were where we wanted them to be now in year 8. So we not only map the standards, but then we track them over time for each cohort. Here you see an example in chemistry, going back to where we started with the progress map, of increasing depth and complexity for a cohort on the atomic model. You can see in year 7, there was an expedition study called What's That Made Of? Students studied their building and the ground beneath the building. It was an opportunity to look at the particle model, to look at the rock cycle, but also then once we got past the particle model, to look at the simple spherical Dalton atomic model. Students, as a product for this, developed skills in doing third angle projections, architectural drawings of plan view, but crucially looked at substances that went into the building of those rooms and how sustainable they were, but in chemistry, their molecular structure also. In year 8, the same cohort, then in an expedition called Elemental, looked at the relationship between elements in the periodic table and the body's dependency on those elements. In some instances, a beneficial impact on the body, and in some instances detrimental, such as this example of a diver who might get the bends. Crucially here, though, you can see that this student, as well as the beautiful artwork that they've produced, has been given access to year 9 knowledge, which is not only looking at the nuclear and electron shell structure of the atom, but also the charge therein. And so in terms of assessment and baked in progression, rather than giving students more of the same in terms of extension work, this student was given access to work which was of a year 9 standard. Another way that we bake in progress is through carefully constructed learning targets and the interplay between those learning targets and sequencing. This is a learning target that I'm currently teaching my students right now. I can describe how the adder and other species in its food chain are adapted to the environment of the humberhead peatlands. Now, the content that would typically be studied in this order, the textbook order, you can see here we'd start with communities and then we get to adaptations, if you notice, towards the end of that sequence of study. Now, I've made some principal decisions in terms of my three-dimensional principles of beautiful work, character development, and academic success. I've chosen to put competition at the beginning because it's foundational for understanding adaptations. I've then gone into animal adaptations, and that's because our case study is focusing on the adder. I want students to fall in love with the adder. I want them to protect the adder. I want them to protect the humberhead peatlands because recently we think human interaction has led to a fire there, which has destroyed a lot of the hibernacular for those adders. And so, while still attending to the order in which students need to study it, I've diverted from the textbook order. Some of these bullet points, I'm still studying in the same order: plant competition, plant adaptations leading to extremophiles, but they will feed into a second learning target about how the sphagnum moss at the peatlands has been able to outcompete other plants. Now, what we've got going on there is students studying learning target 1, then learning target 2, going back to learning target 1, learning some more that will help them with learning target 2, and then coming back to learning target 1 again. So there's built-in interleaving within the structure of the interplay of the learning targets with the sequencing of the knowledge. Robbie's now going to talk a little bit about theory underpinning that in terms of semantic gravity and semantic depth.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about some work by Professor Carl Mayton on legitimation code theory. And in particular, I'm going to focus in on one of the dimensions of legitimation code theory called semantics. And semantics can be divided into two parts, into semantic gravity, which is the degree to which meaning is dependent on context, and semantic density, which is the degree to which meanings are condensed within practice. Now, what I personally find really interesting about semantics is how semantic gravity can be shown to change over time. So in this way, semantics can be plotted on a profile called a semantic wave. So if you look at A, we've got a high semantic flatline, and this shows that the concept is highly abstract and weakly dependent on context. However, if you look at B, the wave shows a low semantic flatline, so the concept is practical, based in context, and has more concrete examples. Now, we can plot these as a wave and therefore show how semantic gravity changes over time, or changes over an expedition. So here I've attempted to map out a semantic wave of an expedition at XP. So semantic waves are really important in understanding the development of the XP curriculum for a number of reasons. And mainly because semantic waves give a theoretical language to the purpose of a guiding question, and what makes a good guiding question, how a guiding question leads to abstract thinking, the purposes of case studies, and how Tier 2 and Tier 3 language is used. So in this particular example, at point A, the expedition begins with a guiding question, and this guiding question is abstract, context independent. And so at the end of the expedition, students will be able to answer it. So students aim to unpack the abstract guiding question through a number of case studies. And this presents these case studies present the guiding question in context-dependent examples. And Mayton argues that this downward shift is vital to connect with students' everyday language and lived experience. Whilst on the unpacking downward gradient though, teachers make frequent reference back up to the more abstract guiding question. And this is so that students can see the relationship between their contextual example in the case study and the more abstract concepts presented in the guiding question. So at point C in the expedition, students have been exposed to a number of context-dependent examples. So therefore, the next phase of the expedition, D, aims to enable students to bring their new contextual knowledge together in order to get a deeper understanding of this abstract concept presented in the guiding question. Students end the expeditions at E with a deep conceptual understanding of the abstract concept, which is built on from the case studies. In this way, the knowledge from the case studies that students now possess is powerful knowledge because it takes students beyond their current context. It's really important to note, though, that not all expeditions follow this U-shaped semantic wave. A guiding question could be very context dependent. For example, who is responsible for World War II? And therefore, this guiding question itself doesn't offer much opportunity for abstract thought. So teachers must be really aware of this, and teachers must bring in the more abstract, context-independent ideas through other means. And they could do this through bringing these abstract ideas in through case studies or as a lens to examine the guiding question. So in the example of who is responsible for World War II, teachers could bring in ideas about cause and effect, national identity, extremism, and economic downturn. An expedition where the students only learn context-dependent examples, so this low semantic flat line, without the opportunity to move up a semantic gradient to more abstract concepts, will just result in students having a list of facts, but lacking deep conceptual progression. And Mayton argues that taken together, downwards and upward shifts enable the recontextualization of knowledge through time, which is a crucial condition for cumulative knowledge building. So ultimately, I think what expeditions do is expeditions give a strong structure to allow cumulative knowledge building or conceptual progression to occur. So in other words, a flow from guiding question to case studies to product has progression baked in.
Yeah, and just to build on that, Robbie, I have a kind of cautionary tale here from our first cohorts who came through XP. And this was at the point where our structure was mapping the standards and grouping them together, but we didn't have those progress maps of a clear through line from year 7 to year 11. So explicit abstraction is needed. I'm going to talk to you about a young man called Reese. I love to quiz kids on the corridor, and I spoke to him about 3 or 4 months after an expedition called Shepherd Street, which I'll come back to in a second, Shepherd Street. I said to him on the corridor, Reese, can you tell me what happens to the particles in a solid when heat energy is transferred into the solid? And he went, which is fairly typical of Reese. Then I said to him, Reese, can you tell me what happens to the atoms in an aluminium pan when it's put on top of the flame on the hob? And he went, oh yeah, right, what happens is the aluminium atoms, they start to do that, they like vibrate because they're storing more energy, and then they bump into the other ones and like transfer energy, and then I think that's called conduction. And I went, this is a problem. Because Reese had only studied in the context of a pan heating up on a flame, and he'd seen animations that his peers had made, which exemplified that, that was the only context in which he understood conduction. And so one of the things that we've been careful to attend to since then is what Robbie has discussed, of making sure that knowledge doesn't exist in context silos, that abstraction is built into the expeditionary design.
Thank you. So now I want to talk about this key question. How do XP teachers design cross-curricular expeditions whilst maintaining the integrity of each subject discipline and disciplinary thinking? Now, this is one of the main challenges teachers at XP face when trying to design the curriculum. And Pountney and McPhail did some research into the expeditionary curriculum at XP, and it revealed that the curriculum making process involves a cycle of 3 stages. Firstly, that teachers show clear attention to their own disciplinary structure of subjects. Secondly, that teachers then look at integration. And finally, teachers then move apart again and show re-attention to their own disciplinary structure in a curriculum review. And this is to ensure internal and external consistency. So I'll attempt to unpack these stages in a little bit more detail. So in stage 1, attention to disciplinary structures at the start forces teachers to look at progress maps and curriculum maps in their subjects. Now, subject experts have a clear understanding of the conceptual structure of their subject. So in hierarchical structured subjects like science, teachers understand that new knowledge builds on existing knowledge. And therefore the sequencing and coherence in these subjects is vital for cumulative knowledge building. Therefore, before teachers even come together to look at how to integrate ideas and build an interdisciplinary curriculum, teachers have thought carefully about what content must be included, and more importantly, why it should be included from their own individual discipline perspective. So in the work on Future 3 done by Young and Muller, they refer to this as boundary maintenance prior to boundary crossing. And Powney and McPhail argue that this attention to progress and curriculum maps enables boundary crossing so that structured access for students to powerful knowledge is not compromised. The second stage of the cycle in terms of designing the curriculum is about integration. And there's lots of research to suggest that curriculum integration is more difficult than it appears. And this is especially the case when the conceptual structure of subjects is different. So trying to bring together a horizontally structured subject like history with a hierarchically structured subject like science can be a real challenge. And there's also a challenge where subjects have different boundary strengths, or topics within subjects. So some topics within science have stronger boundaries than others, and therefore these topics with stronger boundaries may be more difficult to integrate with other subjects. So curriculum integration can happen in different ways, and Powney and McPhail's work on the continuum of integration in interdisciplinary curriculum design is a useful way in articulating how teachers integrate different concepts and different subjects. So firstly, subjects may be integrated in a functional way through a shared context or topic or an external organizer. And there's evidence to suggest that having a shared context between subjects may lead to higher student engagement. On the other hand, subjects may be integrated through a principled conceptual approach without the need for context sharing. And this places the emphasis on knowledge building and conceptual progression as the driver for curriculum integration. Or we may have some integration in the middle of this continuum, where integration is used to develop novel insights into one discipline by looking at it through the lens of another. For example, reading on the origin of the species in science, but then also learning about the impact it had on secularization in the UK when they're doing that in RE or history. So Bernstein states that the nature of linkage between the integrating idea and the knowledge coordinated must be coherently spelled out. So XP teachers need to be clear on why they're trying to integrate these subjects, and teachers articulate this through the guiding question. Finally, on this idea of integration, it's important to note that teachers at XP need more subject knowledge and more subject pedagogical content knowledge, not less, to be able to integrate subjects.
So how does this work in practice of our teachers making the curriculum together? Well, working in expedition teams primarily, I will teach at the moment Year 9, and I typically just work with the other Year 9 teachers when we're planning that aspect of the curriculum. Teachers are collectively responsible for rigorously designing and testing their plans, and it's a process that they find both exciting and liberating. It's exciting to combine aspects of the curriculum in this way, and there's a high level of agency. As we've mentioned, XP's curriculum is standards-based, and our curriculum differs from other 21st century or Future 2 curricula in that whilst the organising principle is external to the disciplines themselves, it is the inferential links between the bodies of knowledge that determine the organisation of what to be studied. So therefore, our curricula structures flow from the bodies of knowledge to be studied rather than from arbitrary themes, products or topics. So as part of this collaborative process, for example, linking together X and Y, the guiding question for chemistry, which we studied, was what has chemistry got to do with cooking? And this is a literal embodiment of the idea of bringing different aspects together through their inferential links. So we were looking at the physical changes, the chemical changes that happen when you boil an egg. And those inferential changes need to be spelled out to the students. They are novices, we are experts, we need to make sure that they understand those links. In order to map the curriculum as a collaborative process, first we atomised the standards to a degree that was manageable, but at the same time meaningful, and they were in turn then given structure by identifying these interdisciplinary links. Staff have increased PPA at our school. Typically they teach around a 70–75% timetable, regardless of how long they've been teaching, and QTs are given a little bit more time. Built into that are times to meet as an expedition team, where you're focusing on the structure of your expedition, but also within subject teams to look at pedagogical content knowledge. We also have a 2-month induction, which starts prior to September. We appoint staff to start in June. Teachers during that time will experience what we call an expeditionary slice, an abridged learning expedition, which is an induction into our curriculum design, pedagogy, and importantly also in this 3-dimensional approach into our culture too.
Okay, so we've talked about stages 1 and 2 of teachers having attention to their interdisciplinary structure of subjects, and then secondly, teachers integrating their subjects. And the final stage is where teachers refocus on their own disciplinary structure by cross-referencing what students have learned in the expedition with internal standards maps and external specifications, and this forms part of a curriculum review. Assessing students in a cross-curricular context is a major challenge, and Pountney and McPhail say that bringing various forms of content together, criteria for assessment may be less visible or underdeveloped. Therefore, the move by teachers to focus on their own discipline during the assessment phase of an expedition makes understanding what the students have learnt much more effective, and therefore they can put that into the curriculum review. Martin's going to now talk more about the curriculum review.
So at the end of each expedition, we have an expedition review, which is a part of our curriculum review. This involves senior leaders, support from Sheffield Hallam University, and also all of the teachers who've worked on the expedition. And it acts as a kind of curricular safety valve. It's comparing the expedition to a set of agreed exemplary standards, and as Robbie mentioned, then mapping back the standards that were intended to be taught and the level of fidelity in the way that those standards were taught and assessed. It allows for change at a number of levels. So, for example, our design principles, we have 5 design principles, our curriculum is informed by those, but also our design principles are informed by our curriculum review. We changed teachers as designers, which there was a heavy focus on curriculum design, which we thought was right, to teachers as learners, because it became clear that not only were we the designers of the curriculum, but through expedition review, we also learned about the design of the curriculum. In terms of management, it's allowed changes at a management level. So we've also instituted things like Jeff's Law, named after a colleague in America, which states things like you must have the narrative, you must be able to tell in prose the story of your expedition before you start, otherwise you haven't carefully considered enough those organising principles which will bring together aspects of the curriculum. There are contextualising things that change as a result of expedition review. In a really prosaic example, we've run out of local nature reserves to make field guides for. What are we going to do? Sometimes there'll be changes to guiding questions or case studies, changes to fieldwork, experts, and in the instance that I've just given you, we need a new product if we can't make a field guide for the nature reserve anymore. Sometimes we change integration. So sometimes you can't just get X into Y, and it can lead to more pragmatic integration. So for example, in an expedition where we were looking at meddling medieval, we linked the feudal system with human organ systems. But what happened there was the big idea, which we thought kids would really understand how digestion works, for example, by studying the typical feudal system diet of a peasant versus a knight. What we really ended up understanding really well was the different diets of people within the feudal system. So what we tend to do now, where we link organ systems with other aspects of the curriculum, especially in social sciences and humanities, it'll be linked more often with people's health more generally, rather than specifically looking at diet. There are also pedagogical content knowledge changes. So to the minutiae of, as a result of reviewing expeditions looking at the particle model, we've now suggested that we need to talk to students, about vaporization. And if they have that language of vaporization, they'll be able to get past those typical misconceptions of the differences between evaporation and boiling, and this idea that when you boil water, the bubbles that you see are air. So this principle of restlessness, it's hard for teachers. We're constantly reimagining the curriculum, so it requires mentoring, critique, and guidance from experts to novices in curriculum design. In terms of the outcomes of this, well, we had Ofsted Outstanding inspection in 2017 in our secondary school, in all areas of the current framework in 2017. We've also had strong GCSE results. I know this year with COVID was slightly different, but the first cohort too also had strong GCSE results, especially in history, English, and science. And there are other aspects of our outcomes which are three-dimensional. You know, most of our students, almost all of them, have Duke of Edinburgh bronze by the time they get to the end of year 9. The students' work lives in the community. They are published authors. Their artwork is in the local hospital. So not only that their work lives in the community, communities have been impacted by our students. A renewed sense of pride in the mining community as a result of the book that our students published about them. So what next? Well, we'd like to think that at XP we're at the coalface of this unfinished project of modernity. We're working with Sheffield Hallam University on the role of subject leaders to ensure that they are custodians of their own disciplinary content. We're developing our model in primary schools and ensuring that the expertise of the founding and experienced teachers across the Trust is available to colleagues in all of our schools. And we will look to add more schools to the Trust. Primary schools within Doncaster, most likely, and we also have an application now for a secondary school in Gateshead, partly because the cohort there are strikingly similar to Doncaster. And so in terms of expansion of the Trust, we think that's a smart move to go to another geographical area where the intake is very similar. So, in conclusion, I hope we've given you an insight into the underpinning theory, working practices that go into our curriculum and our curriculum making, and also what this looks like in practice. Our emails are on this slide. If you'd like any further information, please do get in contact. But at XP, we do believe that a Future 3 school is possible, and we're working on it. Just give us a bit of time. Thanks very much.